Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. I'm joined today by Jeff Grant, who has a fascinating story, and we're going to jump in just a moment. For context, for those who are watching, Jeff is private general counsel and a white-collar attorney who served almost 14 months in federal prison for a white-collar crime. He's gone on to start a organization called Progressive Prison Ministries, and he earned his Master's of Divinity from the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And he also started an organization called GrantLaw to help other folks who have been in similar situations to himself. He's also in recovery from addiction for over 20 years. So congratulations for all of your accomplishments. And I'm going to jump in just to ask you, Jeff, if you can give a brief version of your story, which I know has taken a lot of twists and turns, but I'd love our audience to have a little context because I think it's an incredible one.
Thank you, Arden. It's really wonderful to be here. And, it's a little daunting to hear my bio headlines at the beginning of a podcast because it really is a very, complicated, nuanced story because I was a lawyer in New York City and then in Westchester County, which is just north of New York. And I became a drug addict, not intentionally, but I suffered through a ruptured Achilles tendon and then became addicted to prescription opioids post that. That lasted for about 10 years, and that led to just declining decision-making and all kinds of physical and psychological and emotional issues. From there, I stopped being able to show up to work. I stopped being able to do a lot of things that I should be doing for my family, for my career. Somewhere in the end of the 1990s, cash was drying up, mostly because of my drug addiction. And I dipped into the into the client trust funds, borrowed some money from there. That happened a few more times, and that was kind of like the deal with the devil, because even though I intended it would be only once, it became a kind of a recurring thing. An investigation started, and I defended myself and defended my law license for a while. Then 9/11 happened, and post 9/11, there were SBA loan funds, much like there are now in the pandemic. There are SBA loan funds available. There were available EIDL funds. And although I would have been successful in applying for an EIDL loan at the time, I just couldn't help myself. I was so desperate. And I lied on the application and said I had a office about a block from Ground Zero. It all came tumbling down in July of 2002. When I couldn't defend myself any longer, and I took an overdose of prescription opioids and tried to kill myself. And then a few days later, wound up in detox and in a rehab.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the addiction piece and how that played into the latter crimes? And do you think that is true for many of the people that you've encountered throughout your career? Do you think if you hadn't developed an addictive disorder, some of these issues still would have popped up? I'm just curious how much you see the interplay there.
Yeah, I've been exploring addiction, compulsion, and white-collar crime for a little while now. And, even as I've accepted complete responsibility for my behavior, I just watched this series on Netflix called Painkiller. And all these years later, I didn't even realize how much I was, a little bit player in an overwhelming societal problem of overprescription of opioids, why that happened, what childhood trauma I had, what character deficiencies I had, what led me into a lot of the decisions I was making. I find it's universal amongst people in our support group, in our white collar support group that meets on Monday nights. Everybody's got something. Nobody goes into this planning to be a white collar criminal. They have aspirations and goals, but the issues either are pathological or environmental. Sometimes it's outside things that happen in their lives, and sometimes it's mental illness, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. Very rarely is it just greed hanging out there without some kind of underlying pathology.
Makes total sense. Talk a little bit about your work at Progressive Prison Ministries. And I'm curious, what are the patterns you see with clients who wind up in that organization? I'm also curious if there are people you encounter, and I hate to think this way as somebody who runs a company in the behavioral health space, but who are beyond help, or who you look at and say this is going to be a harder path for them than it is for many others.
Well, on one extreme, there certainly are a percentage of people who are sociopathic, and I don't know that it can provide any help for them. But as a support group, we try to capture as many people as we can who are in the throes of the criminal justice system, and specifically the white collar criminal justice system. They've entered a new community in a new world once they've become a target or they've been arrested, and almost without exception have to learn a new way of life in order to cope. How to develop these coping mechanisms, how to get success. It has a lot to do with acceptance of their new social location, and everyone goes through that path differently. Different rates of acceptance, different rates of whether or not they actually want to change. Some people never want to change. Some people can't change. Some people don't have to change because they're going through their issues, and then they come out and they have a family business, or they still have money in the bank, and they don't want to look at themselves very closely. But most people who go through it have been through some form of transformation, and we help kind of guide them through that to a new, healthier way of life, and often a better way of life than when they started. Maybe not as much money, but certainly a more spiritual rather than material way of life.
I guess that's one of my questions too. When you think about the folks who wind up committing white collar crimes, do the financial institutions we have in this country, do they promote or unintentionally reward people who have values that lead them, or behaviors that lead them down this path?
It's not a one size fits all, that's for sure. But if I stood in front of the freshman class at Goldman Sachs, for example, and there are 500 young people sitting there, all eager to start their careers and sit through stupid lectures by people like me, and I looked and I said to them, look around the room. Sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, 2% of you are going to be the subject of a criminal investigation. Would they do anything differently? Would they be more careful? I don't know. The lure of huge benefits, and that could be tens of millions of dollars potentially, offsets a lot of risk. And everyone tends to think, oh, it's not going to happen to me. But of course, when it does happen to you, it brings down a lot more than just you. It brings down your family, it brings down your friends, and sometimes an entire community. And so I don't think that people are aware of what the downside is and how devastating it can be. Do I think that institutions don't provide enough of that information? No, I don't think they provide enough information. And I don't think that they screen people well enough in their psychological and psychiatric profiles to determine who would be right for those jobs that are exposed to confidential information, insider information, things like that. But they probably do the best that they can. I mean, I don't know that anybody's going to do that deep of a dive in advance to find out who's most likely to, say, commit insider trading. But sometimes it's just a crime of opportunity, and we do the best we can, both as a support group and all the ancillary services we provide, to let them know that their lives aren't over and they can start again, and it doesn't have to be a life sentence. That's the thing about being convicted of a crime. No matter how long the length of sentence, it's a life sentence.
Of course.
And it's unfair. There's not a lot of public empathy and sympathy for people who are convicted for white-collar crimes, but it's getting better. There's no question that at least people understand it more. It's become dinner table conversation.
I think that's interesting. And that was one of my questions when you think about the recovery process for folks convicted of white-collar crime. I think about folks who've been titans of industry, have had tremendous careers, have financially benefited at times from their behaviors. What does it look like in terms of reckoning the ego part of that experience with life in a more modest fashion? I mean, is it for folks that want to get back to some of the same success they had before? Is that possible? Can you do so in a way, with a different lens and a different set of values? Or what are your thoughts about how folks can get to a better place emotionally, kind of given where they've come from?
Well, I'm an outlier, because I actually got my law license back. So I don't think of it as getting my law license back. I think of it as getting my law license forward, because I never want to go back to the levels of stress and other issues that led me to having a problem the first time. But for the most part, people can't go back. They have to kind of get into acceptance of having two separate lives: the life before these issues and the life after. And the life before wasn't necessarily all that great to begin with. Not that there weren't a lot of advantages and trappings, but usually before people come to us, they're looking over their shoulder for years. Things have been going in a strange direction. They're afraid of getting caught. They've been under a lot of stress for a lot of years. The thing is that if they get into acceptance about having two separate lives, then they can understand that maybe the first life is as a hedge funder, and maybe the second life is as a drug and alcohol counselor. There's just an example. But it can be a financial comeuppance. But it's really only the order of things that defines the problem. I mean, I can understand why a hedge funder who's making a lot of money wouldn't want a second life as a drug and alcohol counselor. That's a much more modest life. But I bet there aren't many drug and alcohol counselors who would mind a second life as a hedge fund manager. So,
Sure.
so it's not the fact that there's two separate lives. It's really the order of them that's the issue.
I think it's a great point. And I think about it as particularly problematic in certain communities. If you think about New York City or Greenwich, Connecticut, all communities I know you're familiar with, where, from my perception, and not to say Boston, which is where I'm from, is immune from this, but there is sort of you can't be too rich or too thin in these communities. And so when you think about what's been praised as the value sets in these neighborhoods, adjusting from a $5 million a year salary to a $75,000 a year salary has its own impact. What do you see as the family's response in these situations? Have you seen families weather these storms effectively? Do they have particular characteristics that you think are important?
There's a lot of wreckage. There's a lot of damage, a lot of trauma, estrangements, divorces. It's rough out there. This is people at their probably undergoing more stress in a relationship and as a family unit than they ever expected. And most can't tolerate it, and probably for good reasons. The breadwinner, the person who's a defendant, has probably been lying, living a double life. I know I did. And most people who come to us certainly report that. Not a lot of trust. It's a strange thing. Let's just talk about guys for a second because it's probably easier. Because most white collar crime is with males. So a guy could have, a couple could have gotten married, and they had dreams, and they were going to raise a family, maybe move to the suburbs, and live a nice life. But it's 10 years after now, and dad has been emotionally detached for quite a while, and there's problems in the marriage, although they may not surface to the outside world. There's a lot of issues going on because of that. They're not real partners anymore, and now these things are happening. Maybe dad's being asked to make ethical choices that he doesn't want to make, or maybe he's crossed the line all over already, and he really wants to go into the bedroom and say to his wife, "Listen, things are not the way I've portrayed them to be, or I'm not the breadwinner I thought I was going to be, and we really have to cut back and live a more simple life. Maybe sell the house, sell the cars, take the kids out of private school, whatever it's going to be." And he's afraid to do that. And mostly the reason I think he's afraid to do that is because he's afraid his wife will leave him. Mm-hmm. And because he thinks that she's only there for the money, and he doesn't really recognize that his wife would like nothing more than to have the husband back that she married 10 years ago. Yeah. But they're not communicating. So sure. So had he had the emotional wherewithal to do that, all of this could come out in a very different way, a more positive way. But he avoids the conversation. He gets sucked into the problem. And then while he's in the problem, he continues to lie. He's telling his wife, even though she finds out about it, he says, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. And everything's not going to be okay. And so hence the lack of trust and, the family unit disintegrating.
So interesting, because it starts from a place of emotional detachment and the consequences that are the result of it. What struck me in the article that I read about your work is that it's not necessarily, and you've said this earlier in the podcast, it's not necessarily people set out to commit these crimes. It's a series of very small but not great decisions that lead them down this path. And this, I think, is one of them, which is, I can't be authentic at home because of what it may cost me. Instead of it coming from a place of, gosh, if I'm able to solve this, if I'm able to get my wife on board with this, I can avoid a whole cascading impact that actually devastates the whole family system. Have you seen families get through this? In the folks you've served, primarily men? Okay.
Oh, sure. But what get through what I mean by get through it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's intact.
Sure.
There's a lot of different ways that could look. I mean, one example would be, in my own example, I had estrangement from my children for a while, and it was difficult. I wasn't the dad that they thought I was. Now, I was a loving father. There's no question that I was a loving, present father, but I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't really know how to, those are skills I just had never learned. And so in some ways, my imprisonment liberated my kids from the huge shadow that dad and my problems cast over the family, and so then they were able to find their way and become their own people. We have like a political climate right now where you see that there are politicians sucking up all the oxygen in the room.
Yes.
And I'm trying to be really fair here.
I was just going to say unnamed politicians.
Unnamed politicians. But I can tell you that successful businessmen, successful professionals, and especially when they come under this kind of scrutiny, they're sucking up all the oxygen in the room. There is no room for anyone else to even go through their own process. And what a gift to be able to help families go through a process that they've been stifled. And sometimes that's after, the person who's being prosecuted. Sometimes that's after they've gone away.
So you brought it up. So I'm gonna pull on this thread just a little bit. Do you think the examples that we've had of politicians committing crimes and having it be so publicly displayed has contributed to others feeling like, well, if they can do it, I can do it? Or do you think they're totally separate issues?
I think societally, I'd be. I have one answer societally that I think what's going on is just terrible.
Sure.
And that's without any, without any political, particular political leaning in that statement. But I don't think that sophisticated business people are really affected by that. It's the real problem here is not so much what the public perceives. The people out in mid-America, the flyover states, they don't, it's what they perceive is not really what's going on here. I mean, this is in many ways dog eat dog competition, everybody doing what's in their own best interest. And that's business people, that's prosecutors, that's defense attorneys. It's everybody's got an agenda. And the more you understand everybody's agenda, the more the person who's being prosecuted can advocate for themselves and make sure that they're getting as fair a shake as they possibly can. From a support group standpoint, by banding all together, there have been 750 people on our support group and our podcast thus far. We're sharing information that was never available before. That gives us power. That gives us strength. We can't be lied to the same way. But from a law firm standpoint, that was the unique proposition that led me to first get my law license back and then open up GrantLaw, because there was nobody out there who was focusing on the real world problem swirling around a person in a family who's being prosecuted for white collar crimes. Now, it's easy to think that, okay, but I've been arrested, I need a criminal lawyer. Sure. But how to find the right criminal lawyer, how to negotiate that, how to make sure that this balancing is done the right way. Not easy. I mean, usually if you get arrested, you call up either, if you have a business lawyer, you call up your business lawyer, or you call up your brother-in-law, or you call up somebody. Everybody knows somebody, but that doesn't make them the right person for you. And then even if you go to that particular criminal lawyer, they don't know thing about business and partnership dissolutions and bankruptcy issues and real estate issues and tax issues and all the other issues that surround a sophisticated business life that are now affected by the criminal issue. But they all have to be considered, because the very worst thing that could happen is that 10 years from now, somebody looks back and says, if I had known then what I know now, I would have done things very differently. So what I present as a lawyer and what the support group presents as a community is all of that information in advance, so that better decisions can be made right now up front. And the results we're getting are incredible. I mean, it's not all quantifiable because this is a very opaque area of the world. Defense lawyers tend to want to define things by the amount of time that their clients get in terms of sentencing. But I can tell you that while that's important, it's far from the only thing that needs to be considered. And the balancing of all of those issues is something that very few in the legal community have focused on, not because of any reason other than why would they? I mean,
Sure.
I've been through it,
Lived
and
it,
so I have
right.
a particular passion for it. I have that lived experience, but also I had a skill set that was driven by being a corporate general counsel and recovery and reentry and being a minister. All these things being able to bring to it that gives a particular perspective that not many people in the country have. Actually, no one in the country has. So it's a singular specialty, and I'm hoping other people follow behind because it's much needed.
I always say, I think if you've lived an experience, even if it's a difficult one, you know it better than almost anybody else. So, it's very much the founding of our company was based on my family's experience dealing with my brother's addiction issue. So what you're saying really resonates, because I think there's nobody you're going to defend more than yourself. And there's no time you're going to pay more attention to a medical diagnosis than when you're the one experiencing it. And so you get a better sense of how a system works. So, if I called you tomorrow and said, I know someone who has just been indicted on a white collar crime, short of just calling you as the advice, which is where I would start, but what are things that they should be thinking about or their family members should be thinking about as they start down this path?
Well, I do think that you actually raised a huge issue, because the way that this all goes for someone is highly dependent on the point of entry. Mm-hmm. Because does that person have their best interests at heart, really? And that's not to cast aspersions against any part of the profession, but are they really focused on what the best long-term outcome is for that person? So I would say that bullet point one is we, meaning the support group, we want to be the first call. And we'll lead you to a lot of the resources that you need. And certainly if it's not the support group and you want to call me personally or as a lawyer, it's basically the same thing. Because we need to find the very best resources. The second is, how does this all work in terms of a budget? Because unfortunately, you get what you pay for, pretty much, in terms of lawyering and a defense. And these things have to be at the kind of right level. A $500,000 criminal defense is not going to necessarily be better than a $200,000 criminal defense. It's not going to necessarily be better or more appropriate for your circumstances. And so you want to make sure that what you're getting for your money is exactly what you need. And that can be a little counterintuitive. Also, there has to be enough money in that budget for evidence gathering and forensics and experts. Lawyers at their very best, all they can really do is introduce evidence and make argument. But the lawyers aren't in charge of the facts, of what the digging underneath is, or in the case of, say, someone who has, say, a drug addiction or mental illness, of doing the mitigation and hiring forensic psychologists and hiring investigators. I mean, I'm not saying the lawyer can't hire those people, but they can't do the forensics. They can't do the investigation. And if there's no money in the budget for that, then all it is argument. It's not underlying facts and underlying evidence to be able to present. And I can tell you that I've been involved in cases that never became cases, because I like to bring in the experts on day one, because I want to know what we've got. I want to know who we've got sitting here and what our best arguments are going to be. And most of the time that means what led them to do this, where we started this podcast. And if we take the humanity out of it, then all this is a numbers negotiation. How many months, how much money? But if we could add the humanity in at the very beginning, then we're talking about people. And we're talking about how this really affects everybody, and how do we get the best or the most just result given these circumstances. And unfortunately, there's a lot of lawyers who don't bring in the experts. And I know your firms are full of experts, but they don't bring in the experts until very late in the game. Sometimes even post-sentencing. So that's just not. I find that's just bad business, and I find it's just not the right way to make sure that the people who you're trying to shepherd through the process get a fair shake.
It's so helpful. I think it's a great point, and I think understanding the backstory behind somebody not only makes a more compelling story for a judge or a jury, depending on how a trial goes, but it gives context as to why you're looking for a certain outcome. And I think your specialty in this particular area and the community you've built is so essential to people, because like anything else, there's a certain stigma. If your crime has impacted people in your community, there's a certain way that these families, I'm sure, feel very alone in the process. And so I just first want to say thank you again for joining us today, and really thank you more broadly for taking this incredible story and experience of yourself to do good in the world. I think I love seeing situations like that where people have transformed their own experiences, positive or negative, into an expertise that can benefit others. So thank you. And thank you to our listeners Thank you. And thank you to our listeners and our audience for tuning in for another episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet. Feel free to leave us a positive review if you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources, and sign up for our newsletter.